sheriff or it should go to the state police in that jurisdiction to handle the investigation, because there's almost a conflict of interest by having the Park Service research issues inside their park. If, say, there happened to be a linkage amongst all these missing people, or let's say there was a linkage between a series of homicides, that goes against what they really want, and that is more people in the park. People need to make an educated decision about where and when they visit, and they need to understand the complexities of what happens there when you don't watch your children, say. And just because you're in a national forest, that isn't a place that's to let your kids roam free, to walk with a complete feeling of freedom and safety, because that's far from true. If you're at the end of a line of people or an end of a line of bike riders or something similar to that, it seems like it's the last one that disappears. Or a person who's in the front of the line and not with the group walks in front of everybody, they lose sight of them momentarily, boom, they're gone. And like you said, a dad could be watching their son play hide and seek on a grassy lawn, step behind a bush playing hide and seek, and 50 seconds to a minute later, that kid's gone and he's never found again. There's, as you and I walk through the woods, we try to find the path. If we're not on a noted trail, we try to find the path of least resistance, meaning we're not going to walk into a branch if we don't have to. We're not going to walk into a rock fall area if we don't have to. Many times, the people, when they're found, are found with scratches on their bodies from head to toe. And sometimes these they're called lacerations, sometimes scratches, and sometimes they're considered to be torn. And in the articles, it says there were giant tears on the body, as though the person was running and just indiscriminately ripping their body and skin apart on thorns and branches and things in the area. Now, that's a hypothesis by the writer, because they truly don't know, because the person's usually dead. And if the person is alive, like you stated earlier, sometimes the person can't speak because they're too young, or another element is that the person can't speak because they have a disability. And this is a real unusual element that we found that doesn't make any sense. And the person could have a disability in the sense that their specific speech is impaired. They could have a disability where they just have never been able to communicate. Or, like I said earlier, they could be the type, say a kid under 2 years old, that just cannot speak, period. They haven't learned to speak. And then the adults that are found, sometimes when they ask them what happened, the person just blanks. I don't really know. I remember walking here, and after that, I don't remember anything. There's a story I write about in the Western book. A guy named Bart Schleier disappeared in the Yukon Territory. And this man was a mountain man to the max, very well educated, knew the woods better than probably anybody in the world, was a bear expert, and he was moose hunting with a bow and arrow, disappeared. RCMP initially didn't really do a good investigation. His friends went in and they did a better one, forced the RCMP to go back in. I interviewed one of the conservation officers that was on that scene, and he said, "Dave, how did you pick the one case in 33 years that we cannot figure out what happened?" And what it was is that they went in and they found bear scat in the area, and they took samples, but there was no human remains in the scat, and there was no clothing in the scat. They found his pants turned inside out at the scene, but there were no bite marks in any of his clothing. He was consumed by something, but it wasn't a bear. And the conservation officer said, bears in the Yukon do not consume people. They may kill you. They may bite you and chew you up a little bit, but they don't consume you in total like Bart Schleier's case. And I asked him, I said, what consumed him? He said, God only knows. And that's the assumption, if you're in bear territory, that this is what's done it. But there's a couple of clues. The pants inside out with no bite marks in them. Clothing found at the scene that should have bite marks in it or torn to shreds. When bears consume somebody or something, they stay on site or they drag it away, and they'll come back and they'll consume it more. But in those areas, they'll find scat with human remains or with clothing in it. They don't find those things. And when they find these people, sometimes there's so few remains found that it's baffling. Maybe they find just the top of the cranium, and that's it. And maybe they find infinitesimal-sized pieces of bones that really are tough to ID as a body part other than their bones. There's a case out of the Crater Lake area again where a couple of rangers went in. I interviewed one of them, said the same thing the guy said from the Yukon. You picked the one case in 30 years I can't explain. Said that in the middle of the wilderness they find this guy dead, pieces of bones just like I explained. They knew it wasn't a scene where a bear had taken the guy because they find this guy's pants as though you and I were standing up and we dropped our pants straight onto the floor and we died. And in the socks, they found bones. In the right pant leg, they found a broken right tibia. That's the shin bone. But the unusual part of this is the pants were unbuckled and the belt was unbuckled and the zipper was down. Yet the pants weren't chewed up. There's no holes. There's no anything. They found his backpack. They found some other items that should have been all chewed up. There was food in the backpack that wasn't touched. It doesn't make any sense. Usually these bears in these areas are not huge bears. We're talking bears maybe 200 pounds, the biggest one, where if they tried to take an adult, that'd be a pretty big fight. Say a child goes missing at a rural ranch in the middle of, on the fringe of a national forest. The search and rescue folks immediately start usually searching as close in as they can and move out. And the further you move out, the less chance, according to the grid search patterns, less of a chance you're going to find the person. And usually when you're in close, you have a large density of people that have already searched the area close, family, friends, and it's at that point when they eventually give up that they call for professionals. Too many times to count, especially a child, it's found in very close proximity to where they disappeared. And a vast majority of those times, they're either found unconscious, and they'll state that in the articles, they're unconscious or they're asleep. And when they wake up, or when you wake them up, you get that response as though a deer in the headlights. They don't know what happened. They don't remember anything. They don't know how they got there, etc. Or on a trail that the search and rescue people had used for the previous 2, 3, 4 days, and they show up the next day and there's a tree laying across the trail and the child is laying across the limbs of the tree. Well, in fact, Whitley brought up a great point that I didn't know about, and it's one of those elements, is that many of the people that disappear, they're wearing bright colored clothing. And I probably would never have keyed on this unless in specific articles the search and rescue people made a note, oh yeah, she was wearing a bright yellow coat, or he was a surveyor and he was wearing a bright orange vest. And you keep hearing this and hearing this, and Whitley read the book and when I was talking to him, he goes, Dave, do you know that this isn't unprecedented? I said, well, what do you mean? Well, there was a researcher in Malaysia, and he sent me the link that there were tribesmen in the outer reaches of Malaysia that knew never to go into the jungle wearing bright colored clothing because it had been historically noted that you would never come back. Oh, and that's exactly true. In fact, we're onto a couple cases in Australia that when you read them, they almost mimic the elements that we're talking about tonight. When we start talking about many of the East Coast books, the topography, the terrain in the East Coast is quite a bit different than the Western Sierras, Rockies, etc. And with that comes different elements that get thrown in searchers' faces. As an example, you have a 2-year-old child that disappears, and people start searching, and you walk up to say, a swamp area. Okay, so the searchers may drag the swamp, and searchers may ignore the swamp. But one thing you're not going to do, you're not going to cross the swamp and go to an island because that 2-year-old's not going to be able to get to the island. Yet there's probably 10, 12 cases I cite in the book where persons eventually found on that island. or they're found laying on a bush in an area that searchers had to go chest deep in order to get there. And it's almost an unfathomable degree of effort to get to the point where the child's at. And when the searchers get there, they're shaking their heads about what they find. Now, how they get there sometimes is there's strange noises that they hear. Maybe there's some other element that pushes them to that place that wasn't noted in the article, but there's nothing obvious that gets them there. It isn't a canine that wants to swim across the bog to get there. It's just an inhuman effort to get there. But where they're found is unbelievable. So the state of Pennsylvania has more children that have disappeared between, say, 1946 and 1959 than any other time in recent history in the U.S. They have more kids that are missing during those years in that area than, say, a factor times 10 than anywhere in the U.S. And I have a map of Pennsylvania on my wall with all of the disappearances on it, and it's absolutely unbelievable. And we call Pennsylvania a cluster in itself because there's so many kids that have disappeared there. And not only are there clusters there, but there's clusters inside clusters. And going back to my law enforcement days, when a suspect commits a crime, they usually don't commit that crime real close to home for a multitude of reasons. People in the neighborhood know the car, people in the neighborhood may be able to identify you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there's two different areas in Pennsylvania where you could almost make out a circle on the map where kids have disappeared, but inside that circle, there's nothing. And in the far northwestern region of Pennsylvania, there's a huge national forest that borders New York, and right now there's 5 disappearances exactly on the perimeter of that national forest, but nothing inside that national forest. But if you thought about this rationally, when families and things go into those national forests to vacation or whatever, you'd expect the kids to disappear inside the national forest. Yet these are on residences, rural farms, vacation homes and things right on the perimeter and not inside. We thought that was really odd. We were talking about this the other day. It's still happening, but the numbers within that year span will just jump right out at you. And the mere number of kids that have disappeared in Pennsylvania has continued on over the years, along with some adults, along with some unbelievable stories, along with those disappearances. And it's one of those few places where there's been double disappearances. Say 2 kids go away at the same time, they're not found. A year later, they're found on a hillside miles away, laying next to each other, dead. It would almost indicate that somehow or another those kids were placed there on that hillside, both dead. It's so far beyond a mere coincidence. It's unreal. When it's difficult sometimes going back 50 years to determine what the weather was when a person disappears or immediately afterwards. But when the articles state, yeah, all of a sudden a storm developed, and the storm lasted for 2 weeks that this person was gone, and it rained, 20 inches in those 2 weeks. It was a completely unbelievable storm. You start to read about these storms that all of a sudden happen, either when the person disappears or immediately afterwards. And they even talk about it wipes out any evidence of the person being there. There's no tracks. It's harder for the canines to track. Blah, 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 blah. Searchers are compromised because the creek's higher. It goes on and on and on. And it's definitely one of the major elements in these stories. There was, tracking the person themselves. There was a small boy named Alfred Beelarts that disappeared in the Rocky Mountain National Park in the late 30s. And him and his folks were walking along a river, and he was the last person there, and all of a sudden he just vanished. Parents were perplexed. Knee-jerk reaction from the Park Service is he went in the river. They actually dammed the river. They searched it for a week. They didn't find him. And they eventually said he's not in the river. And they bring in a canine, and this canine tracks Alfred up 1,000 foot in elevation, and they get to a fork in the trail